At this time, the North had become very much discouraged. Many strong Union men believed that the war must prove a failure. The elections of 1862 had gone against the party which was for the prosecution of the war to save the Union if it took the last man and the last dollar. Voluntary enlistments had ceased throughout the greater part of the North, and the draft had been resorted to fill up our ranks. It was my judgment at the time that to make a backward movement as long as that from Vicksburg to Memphis would be interpreted, by many of those yet full of hope for the preservation of the Union, as a defeat, and that the draft would be resisted, desertions ensue, and the power to capture and punish deserters lost. There was nothing left to be done but to go forward to a decisive victory. This was in my mind from the moment I took command in person at Young's Point. The winter of 1862-3 was a noted one for continuous high water in the Mississippi and for heavy rains along the lower river. To get dry land, or rather land above the water to encamp the troops upon, took many miles of riverfront. We had to occupy the levees and the ground immediately behind. This was so limited that one corps, the 17th, under General McPherson, was at Lake Providence, 70 miles above Vicksburg. It was in January the troops took their position opposite Vicksburg. The water was very high and the rains were incessant. There seemed no possibility of a land movement before the end of March or later, and it would not do to lie idle all this time. The effect would be demoralizing to the troops and injurious to their health. Friends in the North would have grown more and more discouraged, and enemies in the same section more and more insolent in their jibes and denunciation of the cause and those engaged in it. I always admired the South, as bad as I thought their cause, for the boldness with which they silenced all opposition and all croaking, by press or by individuals, within their control. War at all times, whether a civil war between sections of a common country or between nations, ought to be avoided, if possible with honour. But, once entered into, it is too much for human nature to tolerate an enemy within their ranks, to give aid and comfort to the armies of the opposing section or nation. Vicksburg, as stated before, is on the first high land coming to the river's edge, below that on which Memphis stands. The bluff, or high land, follows the left bank of the Yazoo for some distance and continues in a southerly direction to the Mississippi River. Thence it runs along the Mississippi to Warrenton, 6 miles below. The Yazoo River leaves the high land a short distance below Haynes's Bluff and empties into the Mississippi 9 miles above Vicksburg. Vicksburg is built on this high land where the Mississippi washes the base of the hill. Haynes's Bluff, 11 miles from Vicksburg on the Yazoo River, was strongly fortified. The whole distance from there to Vicksburg and thence to Warrenton was also entrenched, with batteries at suitable distances and rifle pits connecting them. From Young's Point, the Mississippi turns in a northeasterly direction to a point just above the city, when it again turns and runs southwesterly, leaving vessels, which might attempt to run the blockade, exposed to the fire of batteries 6 miles below the city before they were in range of the upper batteries. Since then, the river has made a cut-off, leaving what was the peninsula in front of the city, an island. North of the Yazoo was all a marsh, heavily timbered, cut up with bayous and much overflowed. A front attack was therefore impossible and was never contemplated, certainly not by me. The problem then became how to secure a landing on high ground east of the Mississippi without an apparent retreat. Then commenced a series of experiments to consume time and to divert the attention of the enemy, of my troops, and of the public generally. I, myself, never felt great confidence that any of the experiments resorted to would prove successful. Nevertheless, I was always prepared to take advantage of them in case they did. In 1862, General Thomas Williams had come up from New Orleans and cut a ditch 10 or 12 feet wide and about as deep straight across from Young's Point to the river below. The distance across was a little over a mile. It was William's expectation that when the river rose it would cut a navigable channel through, but the canal started in an eddy from both ends, and of course it only filled up with water on the rise without doing any execution in the way of cutting. Mr. Lincoln had navigated the Mississippi in his younger days and understood well its tendency to change its channel in places from time to time. He set much store accordingly by this canal. General McClernand had been therefore directed before I went to Young's Point to push the work of widening and deepening this canal. After my arrival, the work was diligently pushed with about 4,000 men, as many as could be used to advantage, until interrupted by a sudden rise in the river that broke a dam at the upper end, which had been put there to keep the water out until the excavation was completed. This was on the 8th of March. Even if the canal had proven a success, so far as to be navigable for steamers, it could not have been of much advantage to us. It runs in a direction almost perpendicular to the line of bluffs on the opposite side, or east bank, of the river. As soon as the enemy discovered what we were doing, he established a battery commanding the canal throughout its length. This battery soon drove out our dredges, 2 in number, which were doing the work of thousands of men. Had the canal been completed, it might have proven of some use in running transports through, under the cover of night, to use below. But they would yet have to run batteries, though for a much shorter distance. While this work was progressing, we were busy in other directions, trying to find an available landing on high ground on the east bank of the river, or to make waterways to get below the city, avoiding the batteries. On the 30th of January, the day after my arrival at the front, I ordered General McPherson, stationed with his corps at Lake Providence, to cut the levee at that point. If successful in opening a channel for navigation by this route, it would carry us to the Mississippi River through the mouth of the Red River, just above Port Hudson and 400 miles below Vicksburg by the river. Lake Providence is a part of the old bed of the Mississippi, about a mile from the present channel. It is 6 miles long and has its outlet through Bayou Baxter, Bayou Macon, and the Tensas, Washita, and Red Rivers. The last 3 are navigable streams at all seasons. Bayous Baxter and Macon are narrow and tortuous, and the banks are covered with dense forests overhanging the channel. They were also filled with fallen timber, the accumulation of years. The land along the Mississippi River, from Memphis down, is in all instances highest next to the river, except where the river washes the bluffs which form the boundary of the valley through which it winds. Bayou Baxter, as it reaches lower land, begins to spread out and disappears entirely in a cypress swamp before it reaches the Macon. There was about 2 feet of water in this swamp at the time. To get through it, even with vessels of the lightest draught, it was necessary to clear off a belt of heavy timber wide enough to make a passageway. As the trees would have to be cut close to the bottom, under water, it was an undertaking of great magnitude. On the 4th of February, I visited General McPherson and remained with him several days. The work had not progressed so far as to admit the water from the river into the lake, but the troops had succeeded in drawing a small steamer of probably not over 30 tons capacity from the river into the lake. With this, we were able to explore the lake and bayou as far as cleared. I saw then that there was scarcely a chance of this ever becoming a practicable route for moving troops through an enemy's country. The distance from Lake Providence to the point where vessels going by that route would enter the Mississippi again is about 470 miles by the main river. The distance would probably be greater by the tortuous bayous through which this new route would carry us. The enemy held Port Hudson, below where the Red River debouches, and all the Mississippi above to Vicksburg. The Red River, Washita, and Tensas were, as has been said, all navigable streams, on which the enemy could throw small bodies of men to obstruct our passage and pick off our troops with their sharpshooters. I let the work go on, believing employment was better than idleness for the men. Then, too, it served as a cover for other efforts which gave a better prospect of success. This work was abandoned after the canal proved a failure. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson of my staff was sent to Helena, Arkansas, to examine and open a way through Moon Lake and the Yazoo Pass if possible. Formerly there was a route by way of an inlet from the Mississippi River into Moon Lake, a mile east of the river, thence east through Yazoo Pass to Coldwater, along the latter to the Tallahatchie, which joins the Yalabusha about 250 miles below Moon Lake and forms the Yazoo River. These were formerly navigated by steamers trading with the rich plantations along their banks, but the state of Mississippi had built a strong levee across the inlet some years before, leaving the only entrance for vessels into this rich region the one by way of the mouth of the Yazoo, several hundreds of miles below. On the 2nd of February, this dam, or levee, was cut. The river being high, the rush of water through the cut was so great that in a very short time the entire obstruction was washed away. The bayous were soon filled, and much of the country was overflowed. This pass leaves the Mississippi River but a few miles below Helena. On the 24th, General Ross, with his brigade of about 4,500 men on transports, moved into this new waterway. The rebels had obstructed the navigation of Yazoo Pass and the Coldwater by felling trees into them. Much of the timber in this region being of greater specific gravity than water, and being of great size, their removal was a matter of great labour. But it was finally accomplished, and on the 11th of March, Ross found himself, accompanied by 2 gunboats under the command of Lieutenant Commander Watson Smith, confronting a fortification at Greenwood, where the Tallahatchie and Yalabusha unite and the Yazoo begins. The bends of the rivers are such at this point as to almost form an island, scarcely above water at that stage of the river. This island was fortified and manned. It was named Fort Pemberton after the commander at Vicksburg. No land approach was accessible. The troops, therefore, could render no assistance towards an assault further than to establish a battery on a little piece of ground which was discovered above water. The gunboats, however, attacked on the 11th and again on the 13th of March. Both efforts were failures and were not renewed. 1 gunboat was disabled, and we lost 6 men killed and 25 wounded. The loss of the enemy was less. Fort Pemberton was so little above the water that it was thought that a rise of 2 feet would drive the enemy out. In hope of enlisting the elements on our side, which had been so much against us up to this time, a second cut was made in the Mississippi levee, this time directly opposite Helena, or 6 miles above the former cut. It did not accomplish the desired result, and Ross, with his fleet, started back. On the 22nd, he met Quinby with a brigade at Yazoo Pass. Quinby was the senior of Ross and assumed command. He was not satisfied with returning to his former position without seeing for himself whether anything could be accomplished. Accordingly, Fort Pemberton was revisited by our troops, but an inspection was sufficient this time without an attack. Quinby, with his command, returned with but little delay. In the meantime, I was much exercised for the safety of Ross, not knowing that Quinby had been able to join him. Reinforcements were of no use in a country covered with water, as they would have to remain on board of their transports. Relief had to come from another quarter, so I determined to get into the Yazoo below Fort Pemberton. Steele's Bayou empties into the Yazoo River between Haynes Bluff and its mouth. It is narrow, very tortuous, and fringed with a very heavy growth of timber, but it is deep. It approaches to within 1 mile of the Mississippi at Eagle Bend, 30 miles above Young's Point. Steele's Bayou connects with Black Bayou with Deer Creek with Rolling Fork with the Big Sunflower River, and the Big Sunflower with the Yazoo River about 10 miles above Haynes's Bluff in a right line, but probably 20 or 25 miles by the winding of the river. All these waterways are of about the same nature so far as navigation is concerned, until the Sunflower is reached. This affords free navigation. Admiral Porter explored this waterway as far as Deer Creek on the 14th of March and reported it navigable. On the next day he started with 5 gunboats and 4 mortar boats. I went with him for some distance. The heavy overhanging timber retarded progress very much, as did also the short turns in so narrow a stream. The gunboats, however, ploughed their way through without other damage than to their appearance. The transports did not fare so well, although they followed behind. The road was somewhat cleared for them by the gunboats. In the evening I returned to headquarters to hurry up reinforcements. Sherman went in person on the 16th, taking with him Stuart's division of the 15th Corps. They took large river transports to Eagle Bend on the Mississippi, where they debarked and marched across to Steele's Bayou, where they re-embarked on the transports. The river steamers, with their tall smokestacks and light guards extending out, were so much impeded that the gunboats got far ahead. Porter, with his fleet, got within a few hundred yards of where the sailing would have been clear and free from the obstructions caused by felling trees into the water, when he encountered rebel sharpshooters, and his progress was delayed by obstructions in his front. He could do nothing with gunboats against sharpshooters. The rebels, learning his route, had sent in about 4,000 men, many more than there were sailors in the fleet. Sherman went back, at the request of the admiral, to clear out Black Bayou and to hurry up reinforcements, which were far behind. On the night of the 19th, he received notice from the admiral that he had been attacked by sharpshooters and was in imminent peril. Sherman at once returned through Black Bayou in a canoe and passed on until he met a steamer, with the last of the reinforcements he had, coming up. They tried to force their way through Black Bayou with their steamer, but finding it slow and tedious work, debarked and pushed forward on foot. It was night when they landed, and intensely dark. There was but a narrow strip of land above water, and that was grown up with underbrush or cane. The troops lighted their way through this with candles carried in their hands for a mile and a half, when they came to an open plantation. Here the troops rested until morning. They made 21 miles from this resting place by noon the next day, and were in time to rescue the fleet. Porter had fully made up his mind to blow up the gunboats rather than have them fall into the hands of the enemy. More welcome visitors he probably never met than the boys in blue on this occasion. The vessels were backed out and returned to their rendezvous on the Mississippi, and thus ended in failure the fourth attempt to get in rear of Vicksburg. The original canal scheme was also abandoned on the 27th of March. The effort to make a waterway through Lake Providence and the connecting bayous was abandoned as wholly impracticable about the same time. At Milliken's Bend, and also at Young's Point, bayous or channels start, which, connecting with other bayous passing Richmond, Louisiana, enter the Mississippi at Carthage 25 or 30 miles above Grand Gulf. The Mississippi levee cuts the supply of water off from these bayous or channels, but all the rainfall behind the levee at these points is carried through these same channels to the river below. In case of a crevasse in this vicinity, the water escaping would find its outlet through the same channels. The dredges and labourers from the canal having been driven out by overflow and the enemy's batteries, I determined to open these other channels, if possible. If successful, the effort would afford a route, away from the enemy's batteries, for our transports. There was a good road back of the levees, along these bayous, to carry the troops, artillery and wagon trains over whenever the water receded a little, and after a few days of dry weather. Accordingly, with the abandonment of all the other plans for reaching a base heretofore described, this new one was undertaken. As early as the 4th of February I had written to Halleck about this route, stating that I thought it much more practicable than the other undertaking, the Lake Providence route, and that it would have been accomplished with much less labour if commenced before the water had got all over the country. The upper end of these bayous being cut off from a water supply, further than the rainfall back of the levees, was grown up with dense timber for a distance of several miles from their source. It was necessary, therefore, to clear this out before letting in the water from the river. This work was continued until the waters of the river began to recede, and the road to Richmond, Louisiana, emerged from the water. One small steamer and some barges were got through this channel, but no further use could be made of it because of the fall in the river. Beyond this, it was no more successful than the other experiments with which the winter was whiled away. All these failures would have been very discouraging if I had expected much from the efforts, but I had not. From the first, the most I hoped to accomplish was the passage of transports to be used below Vicksburg, without exposure to the long line of batteries defending that city. This long, dreary, and, for heavy and continuous rains and high water, unprecedented winter was one of great hardship to all engaged about Vicksburg. The river was higher than its natural banks from December 1862 to the following April. The war had suspended peaceful pursuits in the south, further than the production of army supplies, and in consequence the levees were neglected and broken in many places, and the whole country was covered with water. Troops could scarcely find dry ground on which to pitch their tents. Malarial fevers broke out among the men. Measles and smallpox also attacked them. The hospital arrangements and medical attendance were so perfect, however, that the loss of life was much less than might have been expected. Visitors to the camps went home with dismal stories to relate. Northern papers came back to the soldiers with these stories exaggerated. Because I would not divulge my ultimate plans to visitors, they pronounced me idle, incompetent, and unfit to command men in an emergency, and clamoured for my removal. They were not to be satisfied, many of them, with my simple removal, but named who my successor should be. McClernand, Fremont, Hunter, and McClellan were all mentioned in this connection. I took no steps to answer these complaints, but continued to do my duty, as I understood it, to the best of my ability. Everyone has his superstitions. One of mine is that in positions of great responsibility, everyone should do his duty to the best of his ability where assigned by competent authority, without application or the use of influence to change his position. While at Cairo, I had watched with very great interest the operations of the Army of the Potomac, looking upon that as the main field of the war. I had no idea myself of ever having any large command, nor did I suppose that I was equal to one. But I had the vanity to think that as a cavalry officer I might succeed very well in the command of a brigade. On one occasion, in talking about this to my staff officers, all of whom were civilians without any military education whatever, I said that I would give anything if I were commanding a brigade of cavalry in the Army of the Potomac, and I believed I could do some good. Captain Hillier spoke up and suggested that I make application to be transferred there to command the cavalry. I then told him that I would cut my right arm off first, and mentioned this superstition. In time of war, the President, being by the Constitution Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, is responsible for the selection of commanders. He should not be embarrassed in making his selections. I, having been selected, my responsibility ended with my doing the best I knew how. If I had sought the place, or obtained it through personal or political influence, my belief is that I would have feared to undertake any plan of my own conception, and would probably have awaited direct orders from my distant superiors. Persons obtaining important commands by application or political influence are apt to keep a written record of complaints and predictions of defeat, which are shown in case of disaster. Somebody must be responsible for their failures. With all the pressure brought to bear upon them, both President Lincoln and General Halleck stood by me to the end of the campaign. I had never met Mr. Lincoln, but his support was constant. At last the waters began to recede. The roads crossing the peninsula behind the levees of the bayous were emerging from the waters. The troops were all concentrated from distant points at Milliken's Bend, preparatory to a final move which was to crown the long, tedious and discouraging labours with success. I had had in contemplation the whole winter the movement by land to a point below Vicksburg from which to operate, subject only to the possible but not expected success of some one of the expedients resorted to for the purpose of giving us a different base. This could not be undertaken until the waters receded. I did not therefore communicate this plan, even to an officer of my staff, until it was necessary to make preparations for the start. My recollection is that Admiral Porter was the first one to whom I mentioned it. The cooperation of the Navy was absolutely essential to the success, even to the contemplation of such an enterprise. I had no more authority to command Porter than he had to command me. It was necessary to have part of his fleet below Vicksburg if the troops went there. Steamers to use as ferries were also essential. The Navy was the only escort and protection for these steamers, all of which, in getting below, had to run about 14 miles of batteries. Porter fell into the plan at once and suggested that he had better superintend the preparation of the steamers selected to run the batteries, as sailors would probably understand the work better than soldiers. I was glad to accept his proposition, not only because I admitted his argument, but because it would enable me to keep from the enemy a little longer our designs. Porter's fleet was on the east side of the river above the mouth of the Yazoo, entirely concealed from the enemy by the dense forests that intervened. Even spies could not get near him on account of the undergrowth and overflowed lands. Suspicions of some mysterious movements were aroused. Our river guards discovered one day a small skiff moving quietly and mysteriously up the river near the east shore, from the direction of Vicksburg towards the fleet. On overhauling the boat, they found a small white flag, not much larger than a handkerchief, set up in the stern, no doubt intended as a flag of truce in case of discovery. The boat, crew, and passengers were brought ashore to me. The chief personage aboard proved to be Jacob Thompson, Secretary of the Interior, under the administration of President Buchanan. After a pleasant conversation of half an hour or more, I allowed the boat and crew, passengers and all, to return to Vicksburg, without creating a suspicion that there was a doubt in my mind as to the good faith of Mr. Thompson and his flag. Admiral Porter proceeded with the preparation of the steamers for their hazardous passage of the enemy's batteries. The great essential was to protect the boilers from the enemy's shot, and to conceal the fires under the boilers from view. This he accomplished by loading the steamers, between the guards and boilers on the boiler deck up to the deck above, with bales of hay and cotton, and the deck in front of the boilers in the same way, adding sacks of grain. The hay and grain would be wanted below, and could not be transported in sufficient quantity by the muddy roads over which we expected to march. Before this, I had been collecting from St. Louis and Chicago yawls and barges to be used as ferries when we got below. By the 16th of April, Porter was ready to start on his perilous trip. The Advance, flagship Benton, Porter commanding, started at 10 o'clock at night, followed at intervals of a few minutes by the Lafayette with a captured steamer, the Price, lashed to her side, the Louisville, Mound City, Pittsburgh, and Carondelet, all of these being naval vessels. Next came the transports, Forest Queen, Silver Wave, and Henry Clay, each towing barges loaded with coal to be used as fuel by the naval and transport steamers when below the batteries. The gunboat Tuscumbia brought up the rear. Soon after the start, a battery between Vicksburg and Warrenton opened fire across the intervening peninsula, followed by the upper batteries, and then by batteries all along the line. The gunboats ran up close under the bluffs, delivering their fire in return at short distances, probably without much effect. They were under fire for more than 2 hours, and every vessel was struck many times, but with little damage to the gunboats. The transports did not fare so well. The Henry Clay was disabled and deserted by her crew. Soon after, a shell burst in the cotton packed about the boilers, set the vessel on fire, and burned her to the water's edge. The burning mass, however, floated down to Carthage before grounding, as did also one of the barges in tow. The enemy were evidently expecting our fleet, for they were ready to light up the river by means of bonfires on the east side, and by firing houses on the point of land opposite the city on the Louisiana side. The sight was magnificent, but terrible. I witnessed it from the deck of a river transport, run out into the middle of the river and as low down as it was prudent to go. My mind was much relieved when I learned that no one on the transports had been killed, and but few, if any, wounded. During the running of the batteries, men were stationed in the holds of the transports to partially stop with cotton shot holes that might be made in the hulls. All damage was afterwards soon repaired under the direction of Admiral Porter. The experiment of passing batteries had been tried before this, however, during the war. Admiral Farragut had run the batteries at Port Hudson with the flagship Hartford and one ironclad and visited me from below Vicksburg. The 13th of February, Admiral Porter had sent the gunboat Indianola, Lieutenant Commander George Brown commanding below. She met Colonel Ellet of the Marine Brigade below Natchez on a captured steamer. 2 of the colonel's fleet had previously run the batteries, producing the greatest consternation among the people along the Mississippi from Vicksburg to the Red River. The Indianola remained about the mouth of the Red River some days, and then started up the Mississippi. The Confederates soon raised the Queen of the West and repaired her. With this vessel and the ram Webb, which they had had for some time in the Red River, and 2 other steamers, they followed the Indianola. The latter was encumbered with barges of coal in tow, and consequently could make but little speed against the rapid current of the Mississippi. The Confederate fleet overtook her just above Grand Gulf, and attacked her after dark on the 24th of February. The Indianola was superior to all the others in armament, and probably would have destroyed them or driven them away, but for her encumbrance. As it was, she fought them for an hour and a half, but, in the dark, was struck 7 or 8 times by the ram and other vessels, and was finally disabled and reduced to a sinking condition. The armament was thrown overboard and the vessel run ashore. Officers and crew then surrendered. I had started McClernand with his corps of 4 divisions on the 29th of March, by way of Richmond, Louisiana, to New Carthage, hoping that he might capture Grand Gulf before the balance of the troops could get there. But the roads were very bad, scarcely above water yet. Some miles from New Carthage, the levee to Bayou Vidal was broken in several places, overflowing the roads for the distance of 2 miles. Boats were collected from the surrounding bayous, and some constructed on the spot from such material as could be collected, to transport the troops across the overflowed interval. By the 6th of April, McClernand had reached New Carthage with 1 division and its artillery, the latter ferried through the woods by these boats. On the 17th I visited New Carthage in person, and saw that the process of getting troops through in the way we were doing was so tedious that a better method must be devised. The water was falling, and in a few days there would not be depth enough to use boats, nor would the land be dry enough to march over. McClernand had already found a new route from Smith's plantation, where the crevasse occurred, to Perkins' plantation, 8 to 12 miles below New Carthage. This increased the march from Milliken's Bend from 27 to nearly 40 miles. 4 bridges had to be built across bayous, 2 of them each over 600 feet long, making about 2,000 feet of bridging in all. The river falling made the current in these bayous very rapid, increasing the difficulty of building and permanently fastening these bridges, but the ingenuity of the Yankee soldier was equal to any emergency. The bridges were soon built of such material as could be found nearby, and so substantial were they that not a single mishap occurred in crossing all the army with artillery, cavalry, and wagon trains, except the loss of 1 siege gun, a 32-pounder. This, if my memory serves me correctly, broke through the only pontoon bridge we had in all our march across the peninsula. These bridges were all built by McClernand's command, under the supervision of Lieutenant Haynes of the Engineer Corps. I returned to Milliken's Bend on the 18th or 19th, and on the 20th issued the following final order for the movement of troops. Headquarters Department of the Tennessee, Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, April 20th, 1863. Second. The following orders are published for the information and guidance of the Army in the field, in its present movement to obtain a foothold on the east bank of the Mississippi River, from which Vicksburg can be approached by practicable roads. The 13th Army Corps, Major General John A. McClernand commanding, will constitute the right wing. The 15th Army Corps, Major General W. T. Sherman commanding, will constitute the left wing. The 17th Army Corps, Major General James B. McPherson commanding, will constitute the centre. The order of march to New Carthage will be from right to left. Reserves will be formed by divisions from each Army Corps, or an entire Army Corps will be held as a reserve, as necessity may require. When the reserve is formed by divisions, each division will remain under the immediate command of its respective corps commander, unless otherwise specially ordered for a particular emergency. Troops will be required to bivouac until proper facilities can be afforded for the transportation of camp equipage. In the present movement, 1 tent will be allowed to each company for the protection of rations from rain, 1 wall tent for each regimental headquarters, 1 wall tent for each brigade headquarters, and 1 wall tent for each division headquarters. Corps commanders, having the books and blanks of their respective commands to provide for, are authorized to take such tents as are absolutely necessary, but not to exceed the number allowed by General Orders No. 160, AGO, Series of 1862. All the teams of the 3 Army Corps, under the immediate charge of the quartermasters bearing them on their returns, will constitute a train for carrying supplies and ordnance and the authorized camp equipage of the Army. As fast as the 13th Army Corps advances, the 17th Army Corps will take its place, and it, in turn, will be followed in like manner by the 15th Army Corps. 2 regiments from each Army Corps will be detailed by Corps commanders to guard the lines from Richmond to New Carthage. General hospitals will be established by the medical director between Duckport and Milliken's Bend. All sick and disabled soldiers will be left in these hospitals. Surgeons in charge of hospitals will report convalescents as fast as they become fit for duty. Each corps commander will detail an intelligent and good drill officer to remain behind and take charge of the convalescents of their respective corps. Officers so detailed will organize the men under their charge into squads and companies, without regard to the regiments they belong to, and in the absence of convalescent commissioned officers to command them, will appoint non-commissioned officers or privates. The force so organized will constitute the guard of the line from Duckport to Milliken's Bend. They will furnish all the guards and details required for general hospitals, and with the contrabands that may be about the camps, will furnish all the details for loading and unloading boats. The movement of troops from Milliken's Bend to New Carthage will be so conducted as to allow the transportation of 10 days' supply of rations, and 1/2 the allowance of ordnance required by previous orders. Commanders are authorized and enjoined to collect all the beef cattle, corn, and other necessary supplies on the line of march. But wanton destruction of property, taking of articles useless for military purposes, insulting citizens, going into and searching houses without proper orders from division commanders, are positively prohibited. All such irregularities must be summarily punished. Brigadier General J.C. Sullivan is appointed to the command of all the forces detailed for the protection of the line from here to New Carthage. His particular attention is called to General Orders, No. 69, from Adjutant General's Office, Washington, of date March 20th, 1863. McClernand was already below on the Mississippi. 2 of McPherson's divisions were put upon the march immediately. The 3rd had not yet arrived from Lake Providence. It was on its way to Milliken's Bend and was to follow on arrival. Sherman was to follow McPherson. 2 of his divisions were at Duckport and Young's Point, and the 3rd under Steele was under orders to return from Greenville, Mississippi, where it had been sent to expel a rebel battery that had been annoying our transports. It had now become evident that the army could not be rationed by a wagon train over the single, narrow, and almost impassable road between Milliken's Bend and Perkins's plantation. Accordingly, 6 more steamers were protected as before, to run the batteries, and were loaded with supplies. They took 12 barges in tow, loaded also with rations. On the night of the 22nd of April, they ran the batteries, 5 getting through more or less disabled while 1 was sunk. About half the barges got through with their needed freight. When it was first proposed to run the blockade at Vicksburg with river steamers, there were but 2 captains or masters who were willing to accompany their vessels, and but 1 crew. Volunteers were called for from the army, men who had had experience in any capacity in navigating the western rivers. Captains, pilots, mates, engineers, and deckhands enough presented themselves to take 5 times the number of vessels we were moving through this dangerous ordeal. Most of them were from Logan's division, composed generally of men from the southern part of Illinois and from Missouri. All but 2 of the steamers were commanded by volunteers from the army, and all but 1 so manned. In this instance, as in all others during the war, I found that volunteers could be found in the ranks and among the commissioned officers to meet every call for aid, whether mechanical or professional. Colonel W. S. Oliver was master of transportation on this occasion by special detail. On the 24th, my headquarters were with the advance at Perkins Plantation. Reconnaissances were made in boats to ascertain whether there was high land on the east shore of the river where we might land above Grand Gulf. There was none practicable. Accordingly, the troops were set in motion for Hard Times, 22 miles farther down the river and nearly opposite Grand Gulf. The loss of 2 steamers and 6 barges reduced our transportation so that only 10,000 men could be moved by water. Some of the steamers that had got below were injured in their machinery, so that they were only useful as barges towed by those less severely injured. All the troops, therefore, except what could be transported in one trip, had to march. The road lay west of Lake St. Joseph. 3 large bayous had to be crossed. They were rapidly bridged in the same manner as those previously encountered. On the 27th, McClernand's corps was all at Hard Times, and McPherson's was following closely. I had determined to make the attempt to effect a landing on the east side of the river as soon as possible. Accordingly, on the morning of the 29th, McClernand was directed to embark all the troops from his corps that our transports and barges could carry. About 10,000 men were so embarked. The plan was to have the Navy silence the guns at Grand Gulf and to have as many men as possible ready to debark in the shortest possible time under cover of the fire of the Navy and carry the works by storm. The following order was issued. Perkins Plantation, L.A., April 27, 1863. Major General J.A. McClernand, commanding 13th A.C. Commence immediately the embarkation of your corps, or so much of it as there is transportation for. Have put aboard the artillery and every article authorized in orders limiting baggage, except the men, and hold them in readiness, with their places assigned, to be moved at a moment's warning. All the troops you may have, except those ordered to remain behind, send to a point nearly opposite Grand Gulf, where you see, by special orders of this date, General McPherson is ordered to send 1 division. The plan of the attack will be for the Navy to attack and silence all the batteries commanding the river. Your corps will be on the river, ready to run to and debark on the nearest eligible land below the promontory first brought to view passing down the river. Once on shore, have each commander instructed beforehand to form his men the best the ground will admit of, and take possession of the most commanding points, but avoid separating your command so that it cannot support itself. The first object is to get a foothold where our troops can maintain themselves until such time as preparations can be made and troops collected for a forward movement. Admiral Porter has proposed to place his boats in the position indicated to you a few days ago, and to bring over with them such troops as may be below the city after the guns of the enemy are silenced. It may be that the enemy will occupy positions back from the city, out of range of the gunboats, so as to make it desirable to run past Grand Gulf and land at Rodney. In case this should prove the plan, a signal will be arranged and you duly informed when the transports are to start with this view. Or it may be expedient for the boats to run past, but not the men. In this case, then, the transports would have to be brought back to where the men could land and move by forced marches to below Grand Gulf, re-embark rapidly, and proceed to the latter place. There will be required, then, 3 signals. 1, to indicate that the transports can run down and debark the troops at Grand Gulf. 1, that the transports can run by without the troops, and the last, that the transports can run by with the troops on board. Should the men have to march, all baggage and artillery will be left to run the blockade. If not already directed, require your men to keep 3 days' rations in their haversacks, not to be touched until a movement commences. U.S. Grant, Major General. At 8:00 a.m., 29th, Porter made the attack with his entire strength present, 8 gunboats. For nearly 5.5 hours the attack was kept up without silencing a single gun of the enemy. All this time, McClernand's 10,000 men were huddled together on the transports in the stream, ready to attempt a landing if signalled. I occupied a tug from which I could see the effect of the battle on both sides, within range of the enemy's guns. But a small tug, without armament, was not calculated to attract the fire of batteries while they were being assailed themselves. About 1:30 the fleet withdrew, seeing their efforts were entirely unavailing. The enemy ceased firing as soon as we withdrew. I immediately signalled the admiral and went aboard his ship. The Navy lost in this engagement 18 killed and 56 wounded. A large proportion of these were of the crew of the flagship, and most of those from a single shell which penetrated the ship's side and exploded between decks where the men were working their guns. The sight of the mangled and dying men which met my eye as I boarded the ship was sickening. Grand Gulf is on a high bluff where the river runs at the very foot of it. It is as defensible upon its front as Vicksburg, and at that time would have been just as impossible to capture by a front attack. I therefore requested Porter to run the batteries with his fleet that night and to take charge of the transports, all of which would be wanted below. There is a long tongue of land from the Louisiana side extending towards Grand Gulf, made by the river running nearly east from about 3 miles above, and nearly in the opposite direction from that point for about the same distance below. The land was so low and wet that it would not have been practicable to march an army across but for a levee. I had had this explored before, as well as the east bank below, to ascertain if there was a possible point of debarkation north of Rodney. It was found that the top of the levee afforded a good road to march upon. Porter, as was always the case with him, not only acquiesced in the plan, but volunteered to use his entire fleet as transports. I had intended to make this request, but he anticipated me. At dusk, when concealed from the view of the enemy at Grand Gulf, McClernand landed his command on the west bank. The navy and transports ran the batteries successfully. The troops marched across the point of land under cover of night, unobserved. By the time it was light, the enemy saw our whole fleet, ironclads, gunboats, river steamers and barges, quietly moving down the river 3 miles below them, black, or rather blue, with national troops. When the troops debarked, the evening of the 29th, it was expected that we would have to go to Rodney, about 9 miles below, to find a landing. But that night a coloured man came in who informed me that a good landing would be found at Bruinsburg, a few miles above Rodney, from which point there was a good road leading to Port Gibson, some 12 miles in the interior. The information was found correct, and our landing was effected without opposition. Sherman had not left his position above Vicksburg yet. On the morning of the 27th, I ordered him to create a diversion by moving his corps up the Yazoo and threatening an attack on Haynes's Bluff. My object was to compel Pemberton to keep as much force about Vicksburg as I could until I could secure a good footing on high land east of the river. The move was eminently successful, and, as we afterwards learned, created great confusion about Vicksburg and doubts about our real design. Sherman moved the day of our attack on Grand Gulf, the 29th, with 10 regiments of his command and 8 gunboats which Porter had left above Vicksburg. He debarked his troops and apparently made every preparation to attack the enemy, while the navy bombarded the main forts at Haynes's Bluff. This move was made without a single casualty in either branch of the service. On the 1st of May, Sherman received orders from me, sent from Hard Times the evening of the 29th of April, to withdraw from the front of Haynes's Bluff and follow McPherson with 2 divisions as fast as he could. I had established a depot of supplies at Perkins' plantation. Now that all our gunboats were below Grand Gulf, it was possible that the enemy might fit out boats in the Big Black with improvised armament and attempt to destroy these supplies. McPherson was at Hard Times with a portion of his corps, and the depot was protected by a part of his command. The night of the 29th, I directed him to arm one of the transports with artillery and send it up to Perkins' plantation as a guard, and also to have the siege guns we had brought along moved there and put in position. The embarkation below Grand Gulf took place at Deschroons, Louisiana, 6 miles above Bruinsburg, Mississippi. Early on the morning of 30th of April, McClernand's corps and 1 division of McPherson's corps were speedily landed. When this was effected, I felt a degree of relief scarcely ever equalled since. Vicksburg was not yet taken, it is true, nor were its defenders demoralized by any of our previous moves. I was now in the enemy's country, with a vast river and the stronghold of Vicksburg between me and my base of supplies, but I was on dry ground on the same side of the river with the enemy. All the campaigns, labours, hardships and exposures from the month of December previous to this time that had been made and endured were for the accomplishment of this one object. I had with me the 13th Corps, General McClernand commanding, and 2 brigades of Logan's division of the 17th Corps, General McPherson commanding, in all not more than 20,000 men to commence the campaign with. These were soon reinforced by the remaining brigade of Logan's division and Crocker's division of the 17th Corps. On the 7th of May, I was further reinforced by Sherman with 2 divisions of his, the 15th Corps. My total force was then about 33,000 men. The enemy occupied Grand Gulf, Haynes Bluff, and Jackson with a force of nearly 60,000 men. Jackson is 50 miles east of Vicksburg and is connected with it by a railroad. My first problem was to capture Grand Gulf to use as a base. Bruinsburg is 2 miles from high ground. The bottom at that point is higher than most of the low land in the valley of the Mississippi, and a good road leads to the bluff. It was natural to expect the garrison from Grand Gulf to come out to meet us and prevent, if they could, our reaching this solid base. Bayou Pierre enters the Mississippi just above Bruinsburg, and as it is a navigable stream and was high at the time, in order to intercept us they had to go by Port Gibson, the nearest point where there was a bridge to cross upon. This more than doubled the distance from Grand Gulf to the high land back of Bruinsburg. No time was to be lost in securing this foothold. Our transportation was not sufficient to move all the army across the river at one trip, or even 2, but the landing of the 13th Corps and 1 division of the 17th was effected during the day, April 30th and early evening. McClernand was advanced as soon as ammunition and 2 days' rations, to last 5, could be issued to his men. The bluffs were reached an hour before sunset, and McClernand was pushed on, hoping to reach Port Gibson and save the bridge spanning the Bayou Pierre before the enemy could get there. For crossing a stream in the presence of an enemy is always difficult. Port Gibson, too, is the starting point of roads to Grand Gulf, Vicksburg, and Jackson. McClernand's advance met the enemy about 5 miles west of Port Gibson at Thompson's plantation. There was some firing during the night, but nothing rising to the dignity of a battle until daylight. The enemy had taken a strong natural position with most of the Grand Gulf garrison, numbering about 7,000 or 8,000 men under General Bowen. His hope was to hold me in check until reinforcements under Loring could reach him from Vicksburg, but Loring did not come in time to render much assistance south of Port Gibson. 2 brigades of McPherson's corps followed McClernand as fast as rations and ammunition could be issued, and were ready to take position upon the battlefield whenever the 13th Corps could be got out of the way. The country in this part of Mississippi stands on edge, as it were, the roads running along the ridges except when they occasionally pass from one ridge to another. Where there are no clearings, the sides of the hills are covered with a very heavy growth of timber and with undergrowth, and the ravines are filled with vines and canebrakes, almost impenetrable. This makes it easy for an inferior force to delay, if not defeat, a far superior one. Near the point selected by Bowen to defend, the road to Port Gibson divides, taking 2 ridges which do not diverge more than a mile or 2 at the widest point. These roads unite just outside the town. This made it necessary for McClernand to divide his force. It was not only divided, but it was separated by a deep ravine of the character above described. One flank could not reinforce the other, except by marching back to the junction of the roads. McClernand put the divisions of Hovey, Carr, and A.J. Smith upon the right-hand branch and Osterhaus on the left. I was on the field by 10 a.m. and inspected both flanks in person. On the right, the enemy, if not being pressed back, was at least not repulsing our advance. On the left, however, Osterhaus was not faring so well. He had been repulsed with some loss. As soon as the road could be cleared of McClernand's troops, I ordered up McPherson, who was close upon the rear of the 13th Corps, with 2 brigades of Logan's division. This was about noon. I ordered him to send 1 brigade, General John E. Smith's was selected, to support Osterhaus and to move to the left and flank the enemy out of his position. This movement carried the brigade over a deep ravine to a 3rd ridge, and when Smith's troops were seen well through the ravine, Osterhaus was directed to renew his front attack. It was successful and unattended by heavy loss. The enemy was sent in full retreat on their right, and their left followed before sunset. While the movement to our left was going on, McClernand, who was with his right flank, sent me frequent requests for reinforcements, although the force with him was not being pressed. I had been upon the ground and knew it did not admit of his engaging all the men he had. We followed up our victory until night overtook us about 2 miles from Port Gibson. Then the troops went into bivouac for the night. We started next morning for Port Gibson as soon as it was light enough to see the road. We were soon in the town, and I was delighted to find that the enemy had not stopped to contest our crossing further at the bridge, which he had burned. The troops were set to work at once to construct a bridge across the south fork of the Bayou Pierre. At this time the water was high and the current rapid. What might be called a raft bridge was soon constructed from material obtained from wooden buildings, stables, fences, etc., which sufficed for carrying the whole army over safely. Colonel J. H. Wilson, a member of my staff, planned and superintended the construction of this bridge, going into the water and working as hard as anyone engaged. Officers and men generally joined in this work. When it was finished, the army crossed and marched 8 miles beyond to the North Fork that day. One brigade of Logan's division was sent down the stream to occupy the attention of a rebel battery, which had been left behind with infantry supports to prevent our repairing the burnt railroad bridge. 2 of his brigades were sent up the bayou to find a crossing and reach the North Fork to repair the bridge there. The enemy soon left when he found we were building a bridge elsewhere. Before leaving Port Gibson, we were reinforced by Crocker's division, McPherson's corps, which had crossed the Mississippi at Bruinsburg and come up without stopping except to get 2 days' rations. McPherson still had 1 division west of the Mississippi River, guarding the road from Milliken's Bend to the river below until Sherman's command should relieve it. On leaving Bruinsburg for the front, I left my son Frederick, who had joined me a few weeks before, on board one of the gunboats asleep, and hoped to get away without him until after Grand Gulf should fall into our hands. But on waking up, he learned that I had gone, and being guided by the sound of the battle raging at Thompson's Hill, called the Battle of Port Gibson, found his way to where I was. He had no horse to ride at the time, and I had no facilities for even preparing a meal. He, therefore, foraged around the best he could until we reached Grand Gulf. Mr. C. A. Dana, then an officer of the War Department, accompanied me on the Vicksburg campaign and through a portion of the siege. He was in the same situation as Fred so far as transportation and mess arrangements were concerned. The first time I call to mind seeing either of them, after the battle, they were mounted on 2 enormous horses, grown white from age, each equipped with dilapidated saddles and bridles. Our trains arrived a few days later, after which we were all perfectly equipped. My son accompanied me throughout the campaign and siege, and caused no anxiety either to me or to his mother, who was at home. He looked out for himself and was in every battle of the campaign. His age, then not quite 13, enabled him to take in all he saw, and to retain a recollection of it that would not be possible in more mature years. When the movement from Bruinsburg commenced, we were without a wagon train. The train still west of the Mississippi was carried around with proper escort by a circuitous route from Milliken's Bend to Hard Times 70 or more miles below, and did not get up for some days after the Battle of Port Gibson. My own horses, headquarters transportation, servants, mess chest, and everything except what I had on was with this train. General A. J. Smith happened to have an extra horse at Bruinsburg which I borrowed, with a saddle tree without upholstering further than stirrups. I had no other for nearly a week. It was necessary to have transportation for ammunition. Provisions could be taken from the country, but all the ammunition that can be carried on the person is soon exhausted when there is much fighting. I directed, therefore, immediately on landing that all the vehicles and draft animals, whether horses, mules, or oxen, in the vicinity should be collected and loaded to their capacity with ammunition. Quite a train was collected during the 30th, and a motley train it was. In it could be found fine carriages, loaded nearly to the top with boxes of cartridges that had been pitched in promiscuously. drawn by mules with plough, harness, straw collars, rope lines, etc. Long coupled wagons with racks for carrying cotton bales drawn by oxen, and everything that could be found in the way of transportation on a plantation, either for use or pleasure. The making out of provision returns was stopped for the time. No formalities were to retard our progress until a position was secured when the time could be spared to observe them. It was at Port Gibson I first heard through a Southern paper of the complete success of Colonel Grierson, who was making a raid through central Mississippi. He had started from Lagrange April 17th with 3 regiments of about 1,700 men. On the 21st, he had detached Colonel Hatch with 1 regiment to destroy the railroad between Columbus and Macon and then return to Lagrange. Hatch had a sharp fight with the enemy at Columbus and retreated along the railroad, destroying it at Okolona and Tupelo and arriving in Lagrange April 26th. Grierson continued his movement with about 1,000 men, breaking the Vicksburg and Meridian Railroad and the New Orleans and Jackson Railroad, arriving at Baton Rouge May 2nd. This raid was of great importance, for Grierson had attracted the attention of the enemy from the main movement against Vicksburg. During the night of the 2nd of May, the bridge over the North Fork was repaired, and the troops commenced crossing at 5 the next morning. Before the leading brigade was over, it was fired upon by the enemy from a commanding position, but they were soon driven off. It was evident that the enemy was covering a retreat from Grand Gulf to Vicksburg. Every commanding position from this Grindstone crossing to Hankinson's ferry over the Big Black was occupied by the retreating foe to delay our progress. McPherson, however, reached Hankinson's ferry before night, seized the ferry boat, and sent a detachment of his command across and several miles north on the road to Vicksburg. When the junction of the road going to Vicksburg with the road from Grand Gulf to Raymond and Jackson was reached, Logan with his division was turned to the left towards Grand Gulf. I went with him a short distance from this junction. McPherson had encountered the largest force yet met since the Battle of Port Gibson, and had a skirmish nearly approaching a battle. But the road Logan had taken enabled him to come up on the enemy's right flank, and they soon gave way. McPherson was ordered to hold Hankinson's ferry and the road back to Willow Springs with 1 division. McClernand, who was now in the rear, was to join in this as well as to guard the line back down the bayou. I did not want to take the chances of having an enemy lurking in our rear. On the way from the junction to Grand Gulf, where the road comes into the one from Vicksburg to the same place 6 or 7 miles out, I learned that the last of the enemy had retreated past that place on their way to Vicksburg,